Known as a wily and shrewd leader, during his 30 years in power, Hosni Mubarak made himself indispensable to the West as he managed to straddle an increasingly militant Arab world while carefully maintaining cosy relationships with the United States and its allies. But it was his brutal and often selective suppression of his own people, as well as a stubborn refusal to relinquish any power, that has forced the ageing president from office. Here's Middle East correspondent Ben Knight.
Hosni Mubarak was a former Air Force pilot who seized power in Egypt after the 1981 assassination of Anwar Sadat. He turned Egypt into a secular and stable society. Against the tide of the Middle East, he kept the truce with Israel, which earned him lucrative military aid from the United States. But it also made him a target. Hosni Mubarak survived a number of attempts on his life as he established himself as a regional heavyweight and an ally of the West. His country remained stable, but it was enforced by a brutal secret police who used Egypt's permanent state of emergency to crush opposition. 6 years ago, Hosni Mubarak tried to appease his critics in the West by holding a presidential election, but it was little more than a fig leaf. It took 3 decades for the Egyptian people to rise up, but their revolution has changed the balance in the Middle East. This was the spark. In January this year, a month-long violent revolution in Tunisia toppled the country's 23-year-long military regime. The revolt helped galvanise anti-government protests in Egypt. Thousands of people took to the streets here after an internet campaign began on Facebook.
We don't afraid from anybody here in Egypt. We are Egyptian people here.
Protesters fed up with poverty, corruption and unemployment tried to invade Tahrir Square, and clashes broke out with riot police. The protests gathered momentum, and President Mubarak declared a curfew in Cairo, sending in the army and cutting off the country's access to the internet and mobile phones. But after that week's Friday prayers, Cairo exploded. Tens of thousands gathered in the capital, setting the government headquarters ablaze and demanding that President Mubarak stand down. The turning point was when the protesters won the crucial support of Egypt's military. Its chiefs recognised the rights of the people and pledged not to use force against them. With that, the massive rallies continued and grew larger as protest leaders called for the March of a Million. Hosni Mubarak tried to make another concession. During his second speech, he said he'd step down after September's presidential election. But that only led to brutal clashes between pro- and anti-Mubarak groups. The world watched the standoff for another week. The protests grew bigger, and then rumours swept through Egypt that Hosni Mubarak was about to resign. But all the president offered his people was defiance. He refused to budge until after the September elections. But less than 24 hours later, the dictator was gone. Not only had he lost the support of the people and the military, he'd thrown away his last chance for a dignified exit from the world stage.